Hello, Cropredy. Um, I've always enjoyed my visits here. I've done been up on stage here a few times. I remember, not the last time, but maybe the time before last, I came here and I read a little bit from my book, White Bicycles, Making Music in the 1960s. And afterwards, I went over and signed some copies in the bookstore. And a few people said to me, because the subtitle of White Bicycles is Making Music in the 1960s, they said, so, what's the next book? Is it going to be about the 70s? Of course it's going to be about the 70s. And I thought to myself, no, no, no. I didn't have a very good 70s. I didn't have much fun in the 70s. And a lot of bad things happened in the 70s, and there's no real great story there. For me, anyway. And I thought, what is the next book going to be? And if I'd known that it was going to take me 19 years to get back onto this stage, I might not have ever embarked on that journey. But it's been incredible, because I've learned a huge amount about all the music from around the world that has shaped our music. And I mean, one of the kind of cliches, or one of the sort of fun facts about British music, is about Morris dancing. You know, people say Morris dancing, the most English thing you can possibly imagine. But the name actually comes from Moorish dancing. And it was originated with British sailors, English sailors, coming back to this country, having been on slave ships and been in Africa and everything, and sort of mockingly imitating the way black people danced. And that's the origin of Morris dance. And if you look anywhere into any corner of our well-known music, you find crazy stories like this. And anyway, it took me 19 years to get this thing done, and it looks it. It's big. But I have a very nice quote from David Byrne, who's read an advanced copy. He said, it's very big, but it's a page turner. So afterwards, I'll be selling them and signing them over there. It's not released for 3 weeks. But it's great to be introducing it here, because in a way, my journey in what we once were allowed to call world music began here. One very important aspect of it. I watched a group called Mosaic singing here on the stage in 1985. And there was a girl, Hungarian singer called Marta Sebastian, who took a solo turn in the middle of the set and sang a Bulgarian song. And I was so struck with the way she sang it and the way she got that open throat Bulgarian voice. I complimented her backstage afterwards, and she said, oh, well, if you like that kind of music, you should come with us next summer. We're all going to this big festival in Bulgaria. So I went with these Hungarians to Bulgaria and started recording Ivo Popazov and the Trio Bulgarka and all that. So, but anyway, just to ease you in to the subject, we'll start with something very familiar, which is Norwegian wood, which is most people think of as the kind of first sign of Indian music's entry into rock and roll, into pop music. And in the book, I tell the story of how that happened, which I didn't know, and which I was fascinated to discover. I'll read just a bit of the text. I thought I was queued up here. Late in the first half of Ravi Shankar's first New York recital on February 2nd, 1957, at Town Hall, Dick Bach fell asleep. Shankar's brilliance that evening inspired critics to compare him to Western classical masters and jazz greats. But Indian music's immense impact on the West in the late 60s can be traced directly back to Bach's Doze. With only about a third of the seats filled, the concert was a commercial flop, but the audience was enthusiastic, and Columbia Records offered him a deal to make an album. But it was Bach who would be the key to Ravi's international future. Had he dropped off out of boredom? No, not at all. Indian music, he explained, quote, put the listener in a relaxed mood and a calm state of mind, which carries him into an area of serenity. Bach may have lacked the 60s vocabulary, but he responded as millions would a decade later. He had tripped out on Indian music. And Dick Bach had a label called Pacific Jazz, and he started a branch called World Pacific to record Ravi Shankar. And Ravi used it as a base. When he toured America, he'd hang out in Southern California, give master classes in the studio. And Bach also let a guy called Jim Dixon use the studio because Dixon had produced some very successful records for him. And Dixon was hustling around LA looking to strike it rich. And he was hanging out in the coffee houses, and he befriended Jim, as he was then called, McGuinn, before he became Roger McGuinn. And Jim McGuinn and his friend Gene Clark started rehearsing at World Pacific Studios. And then he brought David Crosby into the mix, and they figured out this cool harmony where Clark and McGuinn would sing the melody together, and Crosby would find weird thirds and fourths and fifths and sixths above the melody, sung by the two other voices. And they really felt they were getting somewhere. And one night they were smoking some joints, and Dixon had been at a session where Ravi Shankar had made his new record. And so he put on the test pressing for the Byrds, they were called the Beefeaters then, to listen to. And Crosby and McGuinn went bananas. McGuinn loved the fact, because he was playing a Rickenbacker electric 12-string, and he loved the way the sympathetic strings of the sitar resonated like the 12-string of his Rickenbacker. And Crosby, he had a much more, I'm paranoid about the wind blowing my papers away. Crosby says, the slow and reflective beginning and the gradual build is very emotional and sexual. It takes you on its trip, then it keeps picking you up and taking you further and further until the intensity is almost unbearable. And anyway, they then had their big hit with Mr. Tambourine Man, which Dixon organized by getting an acetate of the Dylan song before Dylan had recorded it and convincing them to do it, bringing Dylan down to the rehearsal. And Dylan endorsed the way they were doing it. And then they went to England to promote Mr. Tambourine Man. They met the Beatles. The Beatles came, this is the summer of '65. And the Beatles came on their American tour and played Shea Stadium. And then they had a week off, and they rented Zsa Zsa Gabor's house in Beverly Hills. And every night was party night. And there was girls and dope and booze and food and everything. And one night, John Lennon and George Harrison ended up in Zsa Zsa Gabor's bathtub, empty. It was big, it was huge and empty. And they were lying in the bathtub, stoned out of their heads. And McGuinn and Crosby were standing on the edge of the bathtub, explaining Indian music to them and telling them how incredible it was. And McGuinn got out his guitar and started playing modal sequences, scales, raga scales. And Harrison was completely entranced, as was Lennon. And so eventually, at the end of the tour, they went back to England, and George went out and bought every Ravi Shankar record in the EMI, the HMV store on Oxford Street, and just started listening to all these Ravi Shankar records. The Byrds, meanwhile, had come back from England on this trip. The one thing they got, they didn't get very well received, but somebody gave them a cassette player, and nobody had ever heard of cassettes. In America, they didn't exist. But the Byrds were fascinated by the cassettes. And when they went off on a nationwide tour, they loaded one cassette, the one cassette they had, or they had two cassettes. One they loaded with John Coltrane, and the other one they loaded with two Ravi Shankar ragas. And they had a camper van, and they traveled all across America. And all across America, all they listened to was John Coltrane and Ravi Shankar. And when they got to New York, they went into the studio and they recorded. I remember when I first heard that record, I thought to myself, where did that solo come from? That is so out. And now I know. It came from 3 weeks across America listening to John Coltrane and Ravi Shankar every day. That's where that solo came from. And meanwhile, back in England at around the same time, a little footnote that I discovered was that when George Harrison was pregnant, when George Harrison's mother was pregnant during the war, she discovered late night on Armed Forces Radio, they used to have a program of Indian music for the Indian soldiers. And she loved it. And she used to listen all the time to Indian music on late night Armed Forces Radio while she was pregnant with George. Anyway, George went back to Oxford Street after he bought all those Ravi Shankar records and walked down the street to India Craft and bought a sitar with an instruction book. And he was fooling around with it, and they went in the studio to start making Rubber Soul. And when they were starting to record Norwegian Wood, John Lennon immortally said to George, "Hey, George, why don't you shadow the melody with that Indian thingy of yours?" And it sounded, as you know, like this.
She once had me. She showed me her room. Isn't it good? Norwegian wood. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit anywhere. So I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. I sat on the rug, biding my time, drinking her wine. We talked until 2, and then she said, "It's time for bed."
But the most fateful thing that happened at that session was not the record. The most fateful thing that happened at the session was that George broke a string. And he didn't have any extras. India Craft only gave him one set of strings. And George Martin said, and this was evening by this time, so no shops were open. George Martin said, "I think you could try calling the Asian Music Circle." And he knew that this wasn't really a place with an office, that it was somebody's home. And I'll just read shortly from the book. He just happened to have the number in his address book. It was the London home of Ayana and Patricia Angadi, a left-wing Anglo-Indian couple devoted to keeping a flame of interest in Indian music alive in Britain. Ringo Starr volunteered to make the call. And when Ayana, that's the father, answered saying, "Ringo who?" his wife and their teenage daughter frantically intervened. A few minutes later, string in hand, the three were on their way to Abbey Road Studios. The group showed their gratitude by inviting them to stick around for the remainder of the session. And George became great, and Patty, his girlfriend and then wife at the time, became very close friends with Ayana and his English wife. And they would go to dinner together, and they'd go to concerts. And eventually, when Ravi came to town, the Angadis invited Ravi and George to dinner. And that is how George met Ravi Shankar. Ravi Shankar had heard about this Beatle and his interest in Indian music, but he hadn't listened to Norwegian Wood, was generally dismissive of Western pop music, and wary of any link between his art and popular fads. That evening, though, the unassuming and thoughtful Harrison confounded Ravi's expectations. Within days, he'd been to George's home to give a master class, followed by supper and a private performance attended by the Lennons and the Starkeys. That evening marked the start of 2 intense and eventful years that forged a lifelong friendship and brought Indian music into the heart of Western culture. And as I go on in the book, I explain how this led to Velvet Underground, Philip Glass, John McLaughlin, John Coltrane, the Grateful Dead, all owe such a huge debt to their love for Indian music. Another completely different strand, and now for something completely different, which is the way Latin music impacted on Anglo-American music. And one of the things I discovered writing the book, which I never knew, which is I was fascinated by, I'd heard that Americans were very paranoid about drums back in the 17th and 18th century. They felt that slaves were communicating and plotting rebellions with drum beats. So drums were banned. But in Cuba, drums were encouraged. Each different group of slaves from Congo, from Angola, from the Bend, at the sort of armpit of Africa there, each group had their own separate clubhouses. They could build their drums, they could have their ceremonies, they could speak their languages. And so this whole very complex culture, Afro-Cuban culture, grew up. Whereas in America, all the slaves' energies was put into singing because they weren't allowed drums, and to playing stringed instruments. And most of them were from the Sahel, where there aren't that many drums anyway, and they have a lot of stringed instruments. So you have this two different, very, very different cultures. And the two cultures met in New Orleans, where Spanish and French families had lived and brought their slaves, and freed African slaves had come there. And it was like New Orleans was like a drip feeder, feeding these rhythms of Afro-Cuban rhythms into American music. And there are so many stories about, Professor Longhair's left hand. You can hear it. You can hear it and feel it in so many ways. But one of the most interesting ways is if you look at the Palladium, which was a dance hall in New York that lasted for 20 years, from the 47 to 67, approximately. And it was right in Midtown. It was huge. And all the best Latin bands would play there every night. And it was right, like 2 blocks from the Brill Building, which is the famous place where all the songwriters were, all the producers, all the hustlers. So much of American popular music industry was created in the Brill Building and by offices and publishers, etc. And people like Burt Burns and George Goldner, who were the key figures in the Brill Building, they used to go all the time to the Palladium and dance. And you can feel it in so many pop records, like Save the Last Dance for Me. It's just full of habanera syncopation, which didn't exist in Anglo-American music until this influence came in via New Orleans and via the Latin craze of the 20s and 30s. But one of the most interesting figures who was so impassioned by Latin dancing, again, was a big surprise to me when I discovered it, was Bill Graham. And I think you all know who Bill Graham was. He was the great promoter who ran the Fillmore West and the Fillmore East. And I just have to. Here we are. In Bill Graham's autobiography, he says he was a teenager in the late 40s when the Palladium opened, and he was an immigrant. He was like a Holocaust orphan who had been adopted by an American family in the Bronx or in Brooklyn, came to live there. My feeling for Latin music grew along with my developing interest in women, looking at them, seeing them move, the rhythmic stuff of how music relates to sensuality. I started going to the Palladium during my senior year in high school. It cost $1.50 to get in, throw my books in the check room and dance for hours on end, till 3 o'clock or 4 in the morning. Sometimes I'd go right back to Brooklyn and go to school the next day. The Palladium years from 1947 to 66 have entered the annals of legend. the mobsters and cops, the mafia controlled the building that the Palladium was, and they hated the idea of all these black and Latin people coming into Midtown and having a good time there. The mobs and the Irish cops hated them too. The mobsters and cops' worst nightmares were quickly realized. An interracial dance floor led straight to the bedroom. Latinos from East Harlem and the Bronx couldn't believe how many eager bagel babies there were. By the mid-60s, Palladium crowds included Jewish, Puerto Rican, and Cuban Italian kids whose parents had met on the Palladium dance floor in the late 40s. Celebrities, jazz greats, everybody started coming to the Palladium. Producer Norman Granz took Charlie Parker there, and within a week they were in the studio making South of the Border, one of the great Charlie Parker records. Keeping my eye on the clock here. George Shearing arrived with his vibraphone player, Cal Jader. They must have dug what they heard. Shearing quickly hired a bongo player, and Jader left to start the first Latin jazz combo. Marlon Brando used to come there all the time, and he got so obsessed with the bongo that he would fly to Havana for bongo lessons. But the most obsessive of all was Bill Graham. And there's a wonderful quote that in his book, he talks about when he got out of the Army. First thing he did when he got back to New York, very first night, was go to the Palladium. My biggest ambition at the time was to someday dance in the corner. That's where all the best dancers would go, where people sat at those tables and watched. After I got out of the service, I went to the Palladium the first Wednesday night. That night, I not only danced in the corner, but I also entered the contest, and I won. You understand what that means? It means, why should I ever want to be president of the United States? Because I've accomplished something better. It was great. God, it was so great. And this passion that Graham had for Latin music, he carried with him all his life, tragically shortened by that helicopter crash. But when he started the Fillmore, one of his dreams was to present Tito Puente at the Fillmore, and finally he achieved it. But before he brought Tito Puente there was a transformative moment when he was always being pestered by bands who wanted to play the Fillmore. And there was this one kid, a blues guitar player from the East Bay, that had a group that was not that interesting. It wasn't that special, but he thought the kid was talented, he was a good guitar player. And so one day, and he was from a Mexican-American background. And so one day Graham said, "Here, take this record and listen to it, and maybe it'll give you some ideas about how to make your group stand out." And he gave him this record, Tito Puente. And you can guess, I'm sure most of you by now can already guess, the name of the East Bay blues guitar player he gave this record to. It was, of course, Carlos Santana. I think Bill Graham always felt that of all the great things he did in his life, you know, bringing Tito Puente to the Fillmore was one, and getting Carlos Santana off and running with his mix of blues and Latin was the other. Another thing that I talk about in the book is the influence of Roma on our music. Roma, of course, is the name we use these days for what we used to call gypsies. Anyway, I'll just drop you into this story here. I think you'll figure it out pretty. Whoa! Around the turn of the last century, a Roma family named Vase I'm doing a big book tour, but you can tell this is the first date. Around the turn of the last century, a Roma family named Vase made their way to Belgium, probably from Wallachia via Bavaria. They found a winter home in a field near the village of Liberchy, where townspeople welcomed them with open arms. Messages could be received and money exchanged at Chez Boursin, an inn where Jean-Eugène Vase led a band for village dances, and the group would put on burlesques to entertain the locals. Jean-Eugène's wife was known as Negros because of her dark skin. When she gave birth to their son in 1910, he was registered as Jean Reinhardt, taking her family name rather than his due to some outstanding warrants for draft dodging. Like most Roma, once they came back to the campsite, they forgot about the child's Gadje, meaning non-gypsy, name. To them, he was always Django, which means I awake in Romany. And then I tell the story of how Django started playing a kind of banjo with a guitar neck on the streets of Paris and got discovered by an accordionist and became the hot player and was offered, had a big offer to tour Britain. And before he was going to sign the contract, he and his wife celebrated in their caravan, which was located in La Zone, which is where all the Roma hung out on the outskirts of Paris, which is now the flea market in the Porte de Clignancourt. That used to be a gypsy encampment with just nothing but camper, with caravans. Theirs caught fire. I think they had a little too many drinks celebrating his new career. And he was so badly burned that he lost the use of two of his fingers on his left hand. And, but he learned how to be a three-finger guitarist, fretting the lower strings with the thumb, wrapping the thumb around the neck, and doing incredible things with just two fingers on the left hand. And eventually, it took a while, but eventually he got people who believed in him, and he had to overcome a lot of prejudice that, you know, Roma weren't supposed to be able. It was black people who played jazz. Roma don't play jazz. Guitar wasn't a solo instrument. He had to wait till Selmer, some Italian luthier, sold the design to Selmer of a big-bodied guitar that was loud enough to stand out in a band. And that was a huge breakthrough for him. And so by the time by New Year's Eve 1937, the quintet, the quintet of the Hot Club of France, ruled Paris. When the German army marched down the Champs-Élysées 2.5 years later, many cafes had posters of Django on the wall besides their pin-ups of Edith Piaf and Maurice Chevalier. A performance of his most famous composition, Nuage, at the Salle Pleyel a year later, brought the house down, and the group had to repeat it twice. The piece seemed to capture a national mood that combined relief at survival with the tristesse of defeat. I haven't got too much time left, just to say that Django died of a cerebral hemorrhage one morning in 1953, just as he was finishing his coffee, fishing rod in hand. He was 43. He'd lived the ultimate Roma life, running musical rings around the Gage while embracing every cliche, ignoring contracts, taking months learning to scrawl his signature, spending his substantial earnings the instant they crossed his palm, buying one new automobile after another, then wrecking them while driving without a license, and listening with childlike wonder and disbelief as people read to him from books on science and history. But he toured once with Duke Ellington in America, but during the Ellington tour, he once interrupted a rehearsal, claiming to hear an error in one of the horn parts that no one else noticed. To everyone's astonishment, the Duke's charts were wrong, and Django was right. In Reinhardt's charred hands, the oppressed cultures of African Americans and Roma were joined. He was proud of his heritage, but aspired to blackness, worshiping first Armstrong and Ellington, then Parker and Gillespie as gods. He would have been gratified had he known that west to east wasn't the only direction influence flowed across the North Atlantic. A young American guitarist stumbled on some Django Reinhardt 78s in 1947 as he was just starting to explore the possibilities of the instrument. His quote, "Django's ideas lit up my brain. He was light and free and fast as the fastest trumpet, running through chord changes with the skill of a sprinter and the imagination of a poet. I loved Django because of the joy in his music, the light-hearted feeling and freedom to do whatever he felt, which nicely sums up how B.B. King, the author of that quote, transformed blues guitar. So I'm going to leave you with a nice little bit of music, which brings us full circle.
Mano a mano hemos quedado, no me importa lo que has hecho, lo que has...
Hello? Anyway, brings us full circle back here to Cropredy. I even before the whole world music thing, I was always loved music from different places. One day in 1966 or so, I walked into Ronnie Scott's old place, the basement on Gerrard Street, and I heard a group called the Blue Notes, which were all the first mixed-race jazz band from South Africa. And I got them a deal with Polydor, but the record didn't sell. And I was very frustrated. I loved the group, I loved Chris McGregor, and I particularly loved their sax player, a guy called Dudu Pekwana. And Dudu and I had this idea that we were going to try to somehow mix rock music with Kwela, with township jive, township jazz. This was 15 years before Graceland. And we did a bunch of sessions. We were never happy. We never felt we'd really accomplished anything. We went to South Africa together and came back with some records of the new sound called Mbaklanga, which is what Graceland is based on. But that music is much more guitar-based than the older South African, the previous generation of South African music. And we didn't know any guitarists in London who could play this sort of stuff. And I said, I know somebody. You know somebody. I gave it to Richard. I gave the record to Richard and Simon. And I said, here, guys, learn this. And I booked them for a session with the South African musicians. And again, we didn't really feel like we'd done anything fantastic, but 4 years ago, somebody dug up all these tapes and reissued them. And it's gotten 5-star reviews all over the place, and it stuns me because it sounds so nice. Anyway, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to go over to the bookstore. We have these these books. They're doorstops, I warn you. You know, they're not for the faint-hearted, but, you know, as I think you'll hopefully will agree with David Byrne that it's a page-turner. It's not an academic book. It's a fun book. It's big. Anyway, but in the meantime, I leave you with Richard and Simon and Dudu Pekwana and Church Mouse.